phone, please? I know, I'm making you do all the work.
Simon is gonna do that. Sorry. Passing on.
Pass it on.
Ja, Matthias.
So what was I saying?
You were talking about the scholars, the old scholars that they used to do the isolation of
Right,
all the materialistic
right,
things,
so-
but that's a cultural thing for them. It's
Well,
not like
I
a
don't-
mandatory thing by
So I
the-
don't want to necessarily say that it was only a cultural thing. I would say it was more of a practice that they actually practiced. In other words, it's a practice that they embraced. And it was really inspired by the main idea that you wanted to live your akhirah than your dunya. That was the main inspiration. It's like, how do I actually make that inspiration? And I think that the Muslim community, and I've said this last time, I think that the Muslims are so busy trying to prove, I would say politically, trying to prove that they are up to date, or they are modern, or are moderate, that they have actually lost their own heritage themselves. They wanted to prove it to others that they actually live that as their own, as their place of focus. It's all about me trying to prove it to others that I'm up to date. It's trying to somehow impress others, that we were more focused on impressing people in dunya than actually focusing on impressing the Lord Almighty.
But Aisha, then isn't there a confusion? As Muslims, we are supposed to be excelling at whatever we're doing, and
Well, absolutely. You are supposed to be excelling in Islam. It's not about isolating yourself from dunya entirely. There's no doubt about that.
but does that come down to intention then, that I am doing this as an ambassador of Islam?
No, you are definitely supposed to be excelling, being a doctor or being a lawyer, whatever you're doing. There's no doubt that you have to actually excel in that. In fact, Islam is the faith where it tells you, وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا, and don't forget your share of dunya. There's no doubt about that. You have to use that as the means to propagate Islam, as the means to grow, as the means to help others, even if you are working in HR, whether you are an engineer, whatever it is, that's actually bringing in civilization. That's actually bringing in quality life for people. There's no doubt about that. But at the other side, I think we have so much indulged in a lot of the dunya that we forgot when it comes to our identity, that it doesn't mean, it's like, okay, it's okay to actually want to live within that. In fact, you have to participate within the society. But the part about maintaining your identity as a Muslim, be proud of your identity. Be proud of your Islam. Teach it to your children. Once they actually see the vibe in you, they're going to be capable of embracing it themselves. How do you actually put in that piece? Put in that piece where, yes, I'm working on my dunya, but at the same time, I'm also maintaining my akhirah. And the part about maintaining the akhirah, this is extremely important to mention, because when we're maintaining the akhirah is, think of it as with your body. when you actually look at your body, you're looking at body, mind, and ruh, and the soul. Now, here's one thing is that the body and what feeds the body is totally different than what feeds the mind. And what feeds the mind is totally different than what feeds the ruh. We usually think that, okay, we would just use these matter, the body, this should be feeding the same way. Not necessarily like that, because the ruh is a totally different substance. It's a totally different substance. The way it is fed, the way that it grows or elevates is totally different. To use the idea that, yes, just like we feed the body, we have to feed the ruh is totally different. It's a totally different mechanism. And that's why when we look at the ruh, for example, it's all about maintaining more of a minimizing the body in order to grow in the ruh. It's about minimizing the body. When you minimize the body, according to Islam, you're minimizing the body, you're then letting your mind have that ability to focus on the ruh. So when you were talking about focusing on the ruh is a totally different thing. It's not getting some form of an ecstasy. We usually focus on the part of ecstasy and some form of trying to feel, that dopamine inside of us, some form of happiness. But the ruh is totally different. That even when you, in order to grow it, and even when you actually feel that happiness within your ruh, it's totally different. And that's why I always say this, and where the Prophet ﷺ was actually telling us that in order to have the growth within your ruh, he was always focusing, amsik alayka lisanak. Uqba ibn Amir, where the Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked, man najah, like, how do I actually get where I would find a place of that serenity? How do I find the place of some sort of feeling that salvation? And he said, amsik alayka lisanak. You have to hold your speech. When you say minimizing speech, what does that actually entail? Minimizing speech actually is really, in it's an implication, minimizing social relations. Minimizing speech has a lot to do with, okay, you're isolating yourself more somehow, because when you're minimizing speech, you're actually minimizing your outer relations. But then he continues and he says, وَلْيَسَعَكَ بَيْتُكَ, and let your home be the place where it would be spacious enough. It's your place of focus. When you say home, this is not talking about a spacious home per se, but this is actually telling you that, and not only minimize your outer relations with speech, but even minimize even the place of where you actually expand, even in your place of movement. So it's minimizing relations, it's minimizing movement, and it's minimizing movement doesn't mean not exercising, of course, but this is actually talking about minimizing the places of entertainment. And then he says, وَابْكِ عَلَى خَطِيئَتِكَ. Why did he actually put that last? Because there's no way that you're going to focus on the inside unless you cut the ties that are distracting you from the outside. So it's taking a different vision. It's redirecting your vision from looking outside, whether outside of your home or outside of your own place, to actually looking inside. It's redirecting the whole vision. And I think as Muslims, I think we find this discussion very many times where you would ask, for example, the young teenagers, or you would ask the people at the masjid, did you find spirituality? And usually the thought is that spirituality is attained in some form of movement, whether it's yoga or some form of ecstasy you're feeling. And this is actually a totally wrong impression and a wrong understanding. It's a very, I would say, more of an Eastern religions, whether it's the shamans, the Buddhists, the Hindus, etc., in where there's some form of touching, there's some form of, some form of attaining through some kind of a physical embodiment. And this is actually a very big place of shirk. And when you ask the Muslims, a lot of Muslims, did you feel spiritual? I think they usually would say no. Well, that's because the definition of spirituality in itself was actually misunderstood. In order to attain spirituality, it's not that you are embodying some form of connection, as a spiritual connection with some being in any way, because that is more of a, like I said, the Eastern religions, in where that is the unity between the person and the divine. That unity between the person and the divine is in the Eastern religions, and they would work on that in unity between the person and the divine, and then they would talk about it as a form of spirituality. And this is extremely dangerous, because a lot of times Muslims don't have the right definition of spirituality, don't have the right even details of how to. If you don't have the right definition, then you're totally lost. And what are you really looking for? What are you really looking for? In Islam, in order to attain spirituality, you first have to start with understanding what is spirituality. Being spiritual is actually living in focus. It's living in focus. It's living in khushu'ah. It's living in a form of redirecting your vision. What is khushu'ah? Khushu'ah is really the ability to embrace and deeply think of what the words of the Lord Almighty are saying. In other words, you're taking out all the different distractions that are distracting you from focusing on the Lord Almighty. And then that way you can gain the power of extreme focus to focus on the Lord Almighty and His magnificence. That's why, whether it's repetition, dhikr, or whether it's, when we're talking about repetition in dhikr, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, it's all about where it's bringing in the focus through repetition. It's reprogramming your mind. It's reprogramming your mind in order to reprogram your vision. It's all about taking out all those different materialistic things that are distracting you from having that focus. And that's why, if you actually look at, for example, Sayyida Maryam, the word al-qunut was al-qunut, which actually means silence, to practice silence, just like the Prophet ﷺ was actually saying in that hadith, that amsik alayka lisanak, hold on, reduce the speech in order for you to expand in what you actually say in terms of dhikr. You're reducing speech in order to work on replacing the dunya speech. Instead of making a people connection, you're making a divine connection with the Lord Almighty. You're making a spiritual connection with the Lord Almighty. So you're reducing one type of speech, but it's not that you're just going to stay silent. No, you're staying silent from that speech that's basically interacting with people, to make that speech actually be redirected towards the Lord Almighty. And therefore, when we're talking about spirituality, we're actually talking about making our mind, again, it's redirecting the mind, to be able to redirect the mind from focusing on the world that surrounds it, to actually focus on the inside, focus on the Lord Almighty's magnificence. But in order to work on the spirituality, it cannot be attained in Islam. In order to make that happen, you have to actually reduce from the different spiritual contaminations. So what is a spiritual contamination? A spiritual contamination, whether it's, number one, whether it's a misconception in the deen. Number two, it's basically things that are harming your health in your body. And number three, they're basically the things that are harming your mind, whether it's the information that's harming your mind, or whether it's contaminating your mind with different with different substances, or whether 4, it's basically whether you're harming your chastity. You're looking at the wrong things. You're interacting with the other sex and so forth, and therefore it's contaminating your spirituality. And number 5, it's basically the wealth. When you look at wealth, we usually think of it at, well, this has nothing to do with religion, has nothing to do with spirituality. But no, the Prophet ﷺ in the ayat were always telling us, no, you have to give from your dunya to gain the akhirah. You would think, well, how's that even related? Well, that's because the second that you would give from your dunya, your brain is being programmed to recognize that the amount of money that I had probably donated means less to me than the gain that I will be getting. It's a trade-off. It's like I'm giving in. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تؤمنوا حتى تنفقوا مما تحبون. You would not actually be believers until you actually spend from what you love. Why? Because it's programming your mind that, yes, I love this dearly, but I'm giving up on it because there is something even more dear to me than that money, than whatever materialistic gain that you have. It's reprogramming your mind. It's redirecting yourself that there's something more valuable. It's a trade-off. How to actually put that in place. So once we actually live that, it's not enough. That's why the Prophet ﷺ was actually saying, ما أمرتكم به فأتوا منه ما استطعتم وما نهيتكم عنه فانتهوا. What I ordered you to do as much as you're capable of doing. But what I ordered you to leave instantly. Why leave instantly? Well, leave instantly because the contaminations can actually grow. Think of it like a virus. You might think of that virus that, yeah, it's a virus that's there, but it's actually multiplying in your body, growing to that stage of incubation and whatever have you, and it's growing inside your body. And then it will actually affect more than just the area that it basically contaminated or whatever it's having its place of incubation, in where it can affect different parts of your body even more than probably your area of where it contaminated. Depends on where it is, where it might actually, just like meningitis, actually affect your limbs, your ability to speak, your ability to see, etc., without you recognizing. Well, that's the same thing. If a virus that small can actually affect our ability to have our body functioning in a certain way, we usually don't think of contaminants of sin actually affecting our spirituality, our seeing, our hearing, our physical motion, mobility. We don't usually think of it as doing the same thing. And that's why this is extremely important, in where, just like when we're talking about, these viruses, and where spiritual contaminations can actually do the same. You might think, well, I'm not feeling the khushu'. You're not feeling the khushu' because you actually thought that contaminant was not something that I needed to focus much on. You thought that contamination was, yeah, it's not a big deal. When in reality, it affected your ability to see through the lens of Quran. It affected you in where it affected your ability to hear the words of the Lord Almighty and think and ponder deeply. It affected what steps you make in life and what decisions you make, and affected your speech, etc. Now you're starting to talk about it. Now your ability to see it is not actually in place. And this is extremely important, because when you see certain illnesses, and where, depending on where they go, and that's the same thing, spiritual contaminants actually affect the heart and the brain. They affect the heart and the brain. And we know that in medicine, that the most dangerous viruses are the ones that actually go in your neurological system, or in your cardiology area, because then it's affecting more. It's going deep into the core. Once it goes into the core, then it's basically affecting the rest of the body. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was actually always telling us in where, when we're looking at those contaminants and where the effect of sin can grow beyond even yourself, by the way. The effect of sin, just as when somebody is, for example, ill, can that sin be contagious? Absolutely. Can that sin be contagious? Absolutely. Where contagious means it spreads to other people. So when we're looking at, for example, the ayah, al-akhillau ba'duhum li ba'din adu, that the best friends on Judgment Day are going to be the worst enemies. The best friends in dunya are actually the worst enemies in akhirah. Why? Well, they were basically then accusing each other that it's your fault why I went the wrong route, why I decided to make the wrong steps, etc. In other words, it goes farther than just you, because it affects the people that surround you. And that's why the guy that killed 99 people, in order for him to repent, he was ordered to take a very important step. And that step was, you have to leave the city that you're in, because that area is contaminated. You have to leave the city. You have to leave that environment. Once you make the move that you are in the process of healing yourself, where you're leaving the place of contamination, that's the only time where you really take that spiritual healing process actually start taking place. But as long as you are in this contaminated area, it's going to be still affecting you. And it's really the same. It's really the same way as how we look at body illnesses, and many times, but it's a little different. We might not notice it. We don't usually notice it because it's a lot easier for us to recognize a virus by seeing certain symptoms, but we usually don't recognize or attribute whatsoever, let's call it spiritual illnesses, in the same way. I really think a number of different reasons why that is the case. I think part of those reasons is that we have been so much focused on only the practice of halal, haram, etc., and the ilm of reviving the faith, just like Al-Ghazali, in where he was speaking about ihya ulumuddin, reviving the principles of the deen. It was in order to understand. It's like, how do you connect with that? And the separation between the sheikh and the students, in where the sheikh is supposed to have more than just a relationship when we're read the Quran, repeat that page, etc. There's supposed to be a type of a spiritual mentorship. That spiritual mentorship, and the society that we're in is spreading the idea and propagating the idea of secularism, that religion is supposed to be a personal matter, none of your business. It's no one to discuss, no one to talk about. That idea is propagated amongst the Muslims themselves. And where in Hinduism, for example, you'll have the guru, in where he's got more of just a place of a religious figure, but he's the guru that can go beyond their spiritual being in just a being, but they will actually go deep in people's lives. But unfortunately, within the Muslim community, I think we had minimized the religious, not necessarily the figure himself. I'm not talking about a sheikh per se here, but I'm actually talking about how far they can even talk about spirituality and religion, and how we actually implement it in our lives, where no, don't even talk about that, because then you will be perceived as being judgmental. You will be perceived as being judgmental. You will be perceived as being offensive. You will be perceived that you had somehow touched on issues that are very sensitive to people, and you shouldn't be talking about it. Just talk about salah. We'll be able to talk about that. Talk about zakah. Don't go further. The second that you go farther, you're going to be then probably asked to be shunned or shushed, because then people are going to be feeling that no, this is not related to spirituality. But when you look at why the Muslim community is not feeling that sense of spirituality, I think it actually starts from the point where we're really so indulged into this virtual filterness, where we don't actually want to see the reality with transparency and actually discuss it without filter, without the sound effects and all those different effects. We have to put things on ground. And that's why when we're talking about one, silence, and that ilm as well, and even the relationship in where no, it's not at all separated. How do we actually understand that when we speak of halal haram, it's not an issue of do's and don'ts, and it's not an issue of, yes, it's somehow just making more and more restrictions. It's not an issue of making more restrictions or more obligations. In the Western society, these obligations, or the halal haram, let's call it that way, is perceived as taking away your freedom. In Islam, it's actually giving you more freedom. How is it giving you more freedom? Because it's minimizing your temptations. Because you yourself on the inside, you've got these temptations that can actually go so strong in you without you recognizing that they will minimize your freedom, because they will be the one to actually be in control. They will be the ones to be in control without you recognizing. So Islam was telling you, you need to minimize on those different temptations, because the second that you let those temptations grow stronger, you're not going to be the one in charge anymore. They are. They will be the ones to be in charge. They will be the ones to decide whether you move forward or you step back and what you run after, because it becomes like an addiction. A person that is living in any addiction, they're not the ones in charge anymore. It's that addiction that determines how much money where they put their money in, how much money they spend, and all of these different things. It's not them determining, and it's definitely not what is in their benefit. It's actually the addiction. Are they now free? They're not free. It's the addiction that's controlling them. That's why there's all these different organizations to help those people that are actually going through substance abuse and addiction. It's because it ruined their life. And that's the same thing. In where it's all about learning how to keep you in control. So when we teach ourselves and teach our children that when we speak about halal and haram, it's not an issue of trying to minimize your freedom, but it's actually giving you more freedom. It's giving you more freedom because it wants you to be not under your addiction control, not under your temptation control. It's giving your spirituality the freedom. Now, once we actually put that in place, that's when we would recognize that spiritual growth is all about learning how to bring in the focus, how to bring in that focus in terms of it's redirect the vision in where you're not looking outside, but you're looking inside. It's redirecting your vision from wanting more of dunya to wanting more of akhirah. How to redirect from feeling the pain to actually feeling that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the force that controls the world around you.
Aisha, on that point and going back to the topic, you know how you were saying, I think that is what causes anxiety and stress, that isolation and that um, it also causes, I'm not gonna speak for our age, but younger kids, it causes identity crisis as well. They don't know where they belong, right? And that causes anxiety. Either you are going to be isolated if you want to follow a certain path. So how to
So here's the thing.
balance that?
I'm not talking about just an isolation for the mere idea of isolation. There's a positive isolation and there's a negative isolation. We're talking about the positive isolation where you're isolating yourself from fitna, you're isolating yourself from haram, you're isolating yourself away from those areas that are
That's
harming
what I'm
your
saying.
deen.
The times that we're living now, there's fitna everywhere. So you are basically just isolating yourself
You're
in an effort to protect yourself.
absolutely.
So that causes anxiety, that causes.
It doesn't
stress.
cause anxiety. It doesn't cause anxiety. What causes anxiety is the negative isolation. So when you actually start taking out the negative isolation, you're going to find more room for positive isolation. So for example, instead of hanging out with the wrong friends, now you're going to find more room and joy in hanging out with the right friends that are actually doing something else. Maybe creativity at the masjid, maybe trying to together do a halaqah, or maybe together trying to visit the elderly, or maybe trying to help with the homeless or whatever it is. Now you're replacing the the negative interaction with a positive interaction. We're not talking about complete isolation, because complete isolation is not necessarily something that they had learned how to do. That's more of too advanced. That's too utopian to ask for. You understand what I'm saying? It's too utopian to ask for. I can't ask for someone that is still trying to learn and grow in their deen to actually ask them to practice the form of isolation that probably Imam Malik was doing. That's too utopian. It's too unrealistic because they're not at that level. So what we need to do is that positive isolation in where it's an interaction that brings in the meaning of value, the meaning of how I actually make it, that energy be put in where it matters and not for the sake of entertainment. So the negative energy, the negative interaction in what we're talking about to be isolated from is the one that's focused on entertainment. Now, in the beginning, it will definitely bring some form of anxiety. It's exactly when you actually talk about people with addiction. The people with addiction, exactly the same way. In the beginning, while they're going through that treatment, they're going to have some form of fitness, some stiffness, and some different, because their body is not used to the reduction of that amount. So that's why in those centers, they would give them cocaine, literally give them and provide them with these different substances because their body is not yet capable of handling a cold turkey cut. They have to reduce it little by little. They'll give them alternatives to give them what they were used to taking. And that's the same thing. When we're talking about that reduction in the beginning, they're not used to that cold turkey cut isolation. They're used to their dopamine just being released. They're used to that type of happiness. It's exactly when you actually tell a person that's always used to taking sugar, that's overeating. Once you actually say, okay, I want to reduce on the amount of sugar, this is the amount of carbs that I want you to take, in the first week, they're going to feel that they're actually deprived. They're going to feel, I can't handle this anymore. It's the first week. Once they start getting used to it, their body adjusts. Their body adjusts to the new style until it starts finding, and here's the point, until it starts finding the joy in the new lifestyle. You understand what I'm saying? And that's the same thing. That's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون هواه تبعا لما جئت به. You will not be a believer until your own temptation, desire, and inclination are actually going in the same direction of what the Prophet ﷺ had actually come with. You know what? It's kind of like saying that the person is going to find joy in probably dhikr, or probably helping the homeless, or probably reading Quran. They're actually finding joy. Let's not just talk about reading Quran, because maybe this is way too utopian for many, but finding joy in an interaction where we're making maybe just a halaqah together, or maybe we're helping one sister overcome her stress because of going through postpartum depression, or maybe we're helping out another sister because she just had a baby, etc. We're trying to create a sisterly bond. So what are we doing? We're actually replacing that negative interaction with a positive interaction. The anxiety in the beginning is actually this transition. So don't fall for it in the beginning as a parent. Don't rush in saying, oh, they're going through anxiety. What's going to happen? Because you're going to perceive it as, oh, it's their fragility. We're doing it wrong. No, do the right thing. Don't rush in letting your perception of, I have to give them what they want, or else she's probably going to go some form of anaphylaxis or suffocate, or etc. No, she'll be okay. She'll be okay. Don't rush. Because if you don't actually take that procedure, you're going to later get her farther and farther in her addiction. You're not helping her. You're getting her farther and farther in the addiction, not getting her out of the addiction. And I don't mean addiction necessarily substance abuse, but I'm talking about addiction even when it comes to entertainment, even when it comes to outside. And which is why, I would usually say in raising your children, even raising yourselves, don't expand your area of entertainment, because it's going to be a lot harder for you to minimize it. Don't introduce yourself to it from the very beginning is a lot easier than actually working on minimizing it, because minimizing it stays that feeling of joy, the feeling of that ecstasy that you were feeling from that joy through that entertainment is still going to stay in your brain. It's like, I want that again and again and again. It's a lot easier for you to reject food that you have never tasted than actually say, I want to cut down on food that I really love. That's the same thing. It's a lot easier to say, well, this is not part of my food favorite, or my food, what should we call that? Like my food, the things that are basically on my menu. But it's a lot easier when you have never tasted it. If I were to give you any meal in probably Palestinian or maybe Syrian meal that you have never tasted, you're never going to crave it. The crave only happens when you have tried it before. And that's why it's a lot harder once they're actually introduced to it, to actually say, okay, now we're going to minimize it. Why did you put them in that fitna from the very beginning? When you put them in that fitna, now you have to work triple the amount to get them out of the fitna than actually the amount. Mom, can I see what that is? Can I go? You could have actually done things differently by not introducing them to it.
And actually we do it a different way, because from the young age, we want to introduce our kids to so many things so they can actually select
Mhm.
what they like and that
Yep.
creates a problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You don't want to expand their choices of selection, especially if it's a place of fitness.
So in that way, and again, yes, I pretty agree with your thing, just that we brought up in different culture and things, so certain things were easy, the age we came in to say, hey, we never prayed for that, right? Because they're exposed to that, you never attracts an age, the peak age where you have more attraction, that passed away too. So for the kids, coming back to Amna's point, that when they, so your recommendation of saying is, so younger age, maybe keep them a little bit more in the groups, which are more aligned with your spirituality or those kind of thing, to get that pass, and then they can introduce themselves to, the thing is how to balance between culture and the spirituality for the kids here.
You know, one thing I would like to say is that a lot of times, especially those that actually came to the US, I think at many times they would assume that they have to somehow compromise that the children are American or British or whatever it is, and therefore I just have to accept the fact that they don't have to be like us. And I get many times not putting in and figuring out that line in where, no, being American does not necessarily mean embracing the amount of entertainment. Being American and living in the American lifestyle, I think it's really important to also recognize that whether you're talking about American or whether you're talking about Russian or whatever culture, the culture of entertainment, that's the very important point. The culture of entertainment or the culture of social relations or whatever, it actually comes from a particular foundation of what you believe is ethical and not ethical. This is extremely important. It actually comes from a philosophical standpoint. It doesn't just happen to be a culture like that. And this is extremely important to keep in mind. Being American, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean getting introduced to that culture, because if you're talking about American, meaning part of, the territory here, sorry, but I have to elevate my legs. This is starting to get, sorry about that. I'm lucky that I have my primary next to me, so.
I have a footrest, should I bring it for you?
No, I just have to elevate my legs every once in a while. I can't handle them being down, so sorry, ladies. Can I have that blanket? Just put it over my legs. It's against my culture for my legs to stand out like that. Sorry about that. Like now we're getting in culture and putting in so many different things.
Is it okay?
That's okay. It's great. Oh, I got it.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm sure.
It would be more convenient, and you can turn your.
No,
chair
it's
down.
okay. It's okay.
That's-
So what was I saying? I think it's really important that we would recognize and even have the children recognize themselves that what you see right now is not necessarily just happening to be American for a new place. And don't allow your children to, tell you that, oh, you're so background because you come from back home. This actually comes from a philosophy in where it regards that in order to be superior, that you have to be Western. And then therefore you are inferior because you come from back home. They have to understand where that mentality comes from. That superiority actually comes from the Western philosophy of colonization, that in order to be superior, it's the white man culture that is superior. It's the English language. If you speak in an accent, therefore you're inferior. If you embrace a non-Western culture, that you are somehow inferior, whether in your understanding of women, your understanding of family roles, social roles, or even preferences and whatever, etc., because that's a very Western colonizing type of a let's call it philosophy. That actually comes from the same idea of really social Darwinism, in where we're superior, we're the latest of what man has developed into or evolved into. And therefore, if you don't embrace that, then therefore you're inferior. And I want you to explain it to your children that no, if you think, if you think that I'm in any way inferior, you really need to scrutinize where your understanding is coming from. Your understanding is actually the one that is the main cause of all the different colonization that actually happened around the world. It's that philosophy. That philosophy is actually destructive in itself because it carries within it viewing that other people are not at your level of evolution. This is extremely dangerous. And then once you actually let them see through that scrutiny and that through that transparency, they would then recognize and be able to think superior than the culture that they're actually living in, the American culture in itself. What actually led to literally all those different Native Americans that were actually killed and brutally killed in the way that they were actually killed? It was to perceive that they were inferior in every single manner, and therefore they didn't deserve to live. Therefore, their culture didn't deserve to live, and the list goes on and on. And that's the same idea in where it was okay to kill people in Iraq, or people in Latin America, or people all around in different areas. It was okay. Why? Because these people are inferior. They don't even have the right to use their own natural resources, even in their own soil. Even in their own soil. That same idea is many times that subconscious mind is carrying without us recognizing. Now, going back, you're like, okay, what does that have to do with any of what I was talking about? I think it's really important that you let the child themselves recognize that to be part of the identity, the most important identity is actually your Muslim identity, regardless of what nationalist embracement that you carry. That's not necessarily what matters.
Kids, in reply, then, it's not socially acceptable. They have to try out those other activities as well. If you just focus
So
on
here's the
science.
thing. Islam doesn't tell you to totally isolate, but Islam tells you to be selective in what you choose. So if you're the community, for example, they'll actually have these choices. It actually comes from even the dance, by the way. Even the dance, you will see, for example, this community will dance in that way, and where, let's talk about Indian dance. It's supposed to resemble, harvest, picking up the harvest, it's supposed to resemble one particular thing. If you look at the dance for the Bedouins, it's supposed to resemble really as how the goats are moving. If you look at the Egyptian dance, it's supposed to resemble how the snakes are moving. It's not just talking about dances, but this is actually talking about entertainment and how entertainment is actually brought in as part of a culture. You know what I'm saying? That's the same thing in where you have to be selective and let them figure out, and you teach them where this is actually coming in from. You teach them how to actually be superior, and far more superior than what they're actually just taking, where they're following blindly. You want them not to follow blindly, but you want to teach them that, listen, you cannot be blind. You cannot be blind in what you embrace. You have to be superior in your identity. As a Muslim, you have to be superior in how you scrutinize those cultures that surround you. This is extremely important, because the second that we don't actually let them learn that, then they're not going to have that Muslim pride. They have to have that superiority, that critical thinking. Go beyond. Don't just fit in for the sake of fitting in. Not because you were born here that, oh, I'm going to embrace everything that is part of the American culture because that's the only way for me to be American. This is extremely dangerous, because The culture is actually coming from a certain philosophy. Why is drinking part of their culture? Well, drinking is part of their culture because they didn't actually have Islam. Why are Jews drinking is not part of their culture, or at least on Shabbat it is. It's because it actually comes from a certain philosophy. And that's the same thing with every single culture, whether it's drinking, whether it's women, whether it's a relationship with women. How did that also develop from a society that lived Christianity at one point into later embracing the postmodern culture? What you think of being American today is not what was being American in the 1980s. You will be so surprised. I always say this all the time. You know, going to public schools when I was a young girl in the 80s is totally different than what you see in America right now. Totally different. Even short dresses were not allowed in school. Here in America, not allowed in school. Shorts and all of that was not allowed in school. Imagine. What, is that not American? I'll assure you that this was America. I'll assure you this was America. Teach that to your children, that what you think of that inclusivity narrative right now coming in, that's not necessarily what America is. That actually comes from the postmodern philosophy, in where it's all about detaching the realities by creating a new narrative, whether it's the death of the author, or whether it's the dichotomy, or whether it's creating a narrative, or whether it's focusing on emotions rather than the argument, and whether it's all of those. We talked about it before in terms of postmodernism. If we don't help the children and assist them with having that critical vision of recognizing, I would call it the symptoms of kufr, they're going to embrace it without them recognizing, because they're just going to think it's just being American. It's not being American. You want to tell me Trump is not American? Why did he go against the LGBT? Oh, he's American as American can be, as racist as racist can be. At the end of the day, is that it's all about recognizing there's no way that you can embrace Iman if you don't recognize kufr. You can't identify your identity if you don't identify and recognize the other identities. You have to recognize, where is it? You have to have that boundary. The only reason why you look different is because your face is different. You've got, yes, other things that I don't see. Other things that I don't see, the DNA and all these different things, I don't see it. But what you see, what you hear, what you say, all of those different things, yes, they're going to make one piece of your identity. What processes in your brain, what processes in your heart is the most important identity as a Muslim. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet tells us that in Allah, la yanduru ila suwarikum, the Lord Almighty does not look at your appearances. But what does he look at? He looks at the taqwa right inside. What shaped your inner identity? What shaped your heart? What shaped your mind? What shaped your vision is going to determine what actions and what behavior you had actually committed, or what you had actually decided whether something is acceptable or not. I know this is I didn't even start yet, but it was supposed to be there. I don't know how I got into that. I'm so sorry. But this is, just on the side. Should we? Yeah, exactly. It's way out of, we're still just at the title that right there. I know it's
No,
like,
what you said is part of the title.
it is part of it.
This is stressful.
Still, she has a different lecture.
Exactly. I actually had something else. I am. It is recorded. Everything is recorded. Oh, don't worry. I'll give it to you.
Okay.
Yep. Don't worry. I'll give it
But
to you.
if you go search under stress, that this lecture will
Yeah.
come under stress.
Yeah, inshallah. Inshallah. So what I actually wanted to talk about when we're talking about stress and all of that, I think understanding evil, why it happens, the different types of evil that surround us, how to shift vision from pain to hope, how to maintain the vision of hope. It's because we're talking about stress, how to maintain those different things. But in order to understand a number of different things, when we have to first define what is good and what is evil. So that's why I actually did the lecture into 3 different parts: the philosophy of evil, why it exists. Because many times when we're talking about stress, it's usually a trauma or a stigma from something, and that starts developing into stress. Number 2 is how to overcome the pains. How does Islam actually teach us how to overcome the pains and what we need to do? And part 3 is suffering and depression necessarily a sign of bad faith. This is also very important to talk about because it's so easy to brush and paint somebody that if they're going through stress or anxiety, that it's actually a sign of bad faith, that they're just too fragile. Is that really the case? And that's what, inshallah, hopefully will be.
That was my question in my mind.
Yep, we'll talk about that. Inshallah, hopefully we'll cover really quick. So the first thing is really in terms of the philosophy of good and evil, in where there are 2 different things. There's absolute evil and there's relative evil. And this is extremely important because when we speak about evil, is every single evil, there you go. I guess I'm old like her. We're on the same age. We're in the same age. So, see, I thought I had some kind of illness, but that actually tells me it's just old age. It was just old age. Right, Grandma? It's just old age. Nothing wrong with it.
Maybe she gonna sleep, right? Too cozy.
Too cozy, there we go. So, well, so yeah, where and why is there evil anyway? So life in Islam was actually created as a test. And that's why the Lord Almighty actually said, الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ, the one that actually created life and death to test you. So a test cannot be attained without a challenge. There's going to be a challenge to your faith. There's going to be a challenge to your life. There's going to be a challenge to your mind. There's going to be a challenge to your chastity. There's going to be a challenge to your wealth and how you actually work to gain it, or how you give up on that wealth. And of course, there's no way that you can actually define nobility. In order to gain nobility, to gain into that nobility, and how do you strive to really live to being that noble being? There's no way that you can live into that nobility unless you actually know the challenge and you overcome those challenges. And that's why evil is not necessarily just a plain evil thing. It's actually a relative thing at times, and there is definitely some absolute evil, but we would usually consider that evil as a general term and not recognize that there are different levels of evil. Absolute evil is attributed to human action if it actually went beyond what the Lord Almighty has defined as unethical. So if I were to say zina, for example, that's absolute evil. We can't say, let's find the wisdom in zina. You're actually looking at absolute evil. There is no wisdom in it because the Lord Almighty defined it as absolute evil. If it contained some form of wisdom, the Lord Almighty would have actually emphasized that there is some wisdom or some good in it, just like alcohol and liquor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did say that إِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعِهِمَا, that the harm that comes from it is actually bigger than the benefit. In other words, there is some benefit in alcohol, maybe in making income, generating whatever different things that we might actually benefit from, but the Lord Almighty regarded that if something may contain more harm than good, we are supposed to eliminate and be focused on the harm, the more harm that is than actually the minimized good. So we've got things that are absolute evil, things that are minimized good, and then containing more evil in it. And therefore, when we speak about materialistic things or things that we can say in terms of, yes, this is an action, it's a subject, then that's all easier. to talk about, then actually talk about different things that might actually surround us, the different things that can surround us, for example, in where the different challenges in life. But we're here looking at the subject in itself. We're here studying the matter philosophically first before we go into the implications, because usually we don't think of the matter at a let me call it as a subject, and we would usually become isolated, or I would say in a cave of that particular harm, and we become caged in it. My mother or my father or my brother or someone hurt me, and then I would live just a captive for that particular situation, and then many times not recognizing. That's why I'm talking about this, is because we have a lot of Muslims actually leave Islam because of this subject, which is theodicy. If there is God, then why is there evil? If there is God, then why is there evil? And unfortunately, a lot of times these things are not discussed in the masajid to actually clarify the subject in itself, because at many times the masajid would actually assume that the people are not at the level of education to even understand these topics, at least from the philosophical standpoint. Those are actually aqidah. And that's a very dangerous thing, is that a lot of the students are actually in Islamic studies classes on Sundays, etc. And they would say, well, we're learning the same things over and over again. Why? Because it's being taught too much of a simplistic approach. This simplistic approach, once they go into a more challenging and more sophisticated, let's call them, arguments, then they're not actually equipped with the information to answer or respond to the misconceptions that are thrown at them. So that's why I think it's important to bring in that scrutiny in how we understand evil as a whole philosophy before we actually approach a very minimized or just talk about a small symptom. There's no way that you can just focus on, for example, if somebody had a fever, and just talk about the fever and just treat it by just putting cold compressions, unless you figure out what's wrong, unless you figure out what is motivating that fever, what's causing it. It could be that the person is actually facing leukemia without you recognizing. Then you have to treat that as soon as possible, because it will be this illness that's spreading around the body and probably becoming fatal. And that's the same thing. When we're talking about different things, and where now we're talking about the subject. So life was created in a pattern of duality, good, evil, male, female, and those dualities, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was always emphasizing them, because if you don't recognize these dualities, then you're not recognizing that the reason why there is evil is really for you to recognize good. Not that there is good in evil always. There can be good in evil. We'll get to it. But there's no way for you to actually gain and attain nobility, because it is only to be attained once you actually recognize it, because piety, goodness cannot actually be known, or good cannot be known without knowing evil. Evil is relative. What you may see as evil, others may not see it as such. If you were to expect the intervention of the Lord Almighty or the divine every time you face something evil, and you expect, well, I made the dua, but he didn't actually intervene to help me out of this evil, and that's why I'm actually in stress, and if I'm under stress, then therefore God didn't change the situation that I'm in, then I'm going to deny God wholeheartedly. Well, that's because many times they don't recognize that the evil that you might actually be in is actually for your cause and not against your cause. And that's where, when you look at evil, it sometimes can be the gift of pain, in where the gift of pain, it may actually be the main reason why, when you look at, this is actually a book that was written. When you're looking at the gift of pain, we usually think of pain as just an absolute evil, and not recognizing that if you don't feel pain, that's the last thing the neurologist would want to see. If you didn't recognize that that doctor just poked a needle in your body, that's a very bad news. It's not good news. So
Blessing.
absolutely. And in this book, this is actually a doctor who is actually specialized in leprosy. And he was actually going to India to treat the patients that in India and Africa to treat the patients that were suffering from leprosy. So he said that in his book, he was actually, in his prelude, he was actually talking about how he was in, going, I think it was Calcutta, or I'm not sure what country or what part of city, but from I remember it was that. And he was on the train, and then he happened to step on like a nail or something, but he didn't feel it. He said he fell, he didn't feel the nail, and in his mind, he knew that not feeling the nail going into his body, but seeing the blood was actually a bad sign. And of course, being a specialist in treating leprosy, he basically went into just imagining and just going into that hallucination. So what's going to happen to my job? What's going to happen to my family? What's going to happen to my career, future, all of that. And then 24 hours later, he basically wakes up from a very long sleep. It seems like that the tiredness that he was in was actually making him numb, where he didn't even feel the pain. But when he got enough sleep, his body, I guess, started getting awake. So the first thing he said that he had done was bring a needle or a pin and actually poke his feet with it. When he poked his feet, he said he felt the pain, and that was what inspired him to write the book, The Gift of Pain. And it's like it inspired him that the most thing that a patient of leprosy would really want is to feel pain. By feeling pain, that was going to give them the main cause to helping them recognize what will actually make them, stay protected. That the reason why they go blind is not because there's a malfunction in their eye, but it's a malfunction in the nerve that they don't even recognize that there's pain. They'll put their hand in the stove and not recognize that this is harming you, and they'll eventually lose their limbs or even lose their ears or hearing or whatever it is. So he actually went in details, and that's one thing, is that, as a doctor, he will tell you that it's actually a gift to feel pain and not necessarily just an absolute pain, and where you would think that it can only be absolute pain, and that's a sign of the sign of the evil of God. But it's actually a sign of the mercy of the Lord Almighty to feel the pain. So it's basically to inform you, to put an effort to change. Pain can also be that motive in order to urge us to change and to remove the suffering. If it wasn't pain, we wouldn't have actually built civilizations. If it wasn't pain, we wouldn't have actually had doctors. If it wasn't fear of the different things that surround us, whether it's nature, whether it's wild animals or whatever it is, we wouldn't have actually built homes. If it wasn't pain of so many different things that surrounded us, we wouldn't have actually brought in all those different educational things in order to help us get out of it. It was really our fear of harm is what actually brought in the civilization or the education, or motivated us to search for different ways to keep us secure. That's the only reason. So pain is not necessarily all bad. So that's why when we actually see, we can probably at times think that we could just eliminate pain, when in reality, it's actually going the other way around. Just like when we look at, for example, the different things that were done in biology or so forth. Pain can also be a way of discipline and purification because evil can actually be a purifier. One may not realize the blessing that they're in until they recognize and see the odds. Fear of evil actually pushes us to seek changes to get in better consequences. And of course, the fear of suffering pushes us to seek education in fear of ignorance, healthy lifestyle in fear of illness, and living in principle in fear of others' retaliation. And there we live in principle because we're afraid that someone else might actually retaliate against us, or sometimes fear of poverty to push us to work. So not always is fear necessarily always evil. The other question that comes up, is God himself evil? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not create absolute evil. Mercy and wisdom are the attributes of the Lord Almighty. But the reason why I put قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ is really, so when you look at the ayah, قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ, I seek refuge in the Lord Almighty, the creator of the horizon. The horizon is also resembling day and night, the darkness and the day. And you don't recognize that this cycle is also a cycle in your life. And that's why I said, min sharri ma khalaq, that you seek refuge in the Lord Almighty from the evils that he had created. The evils that he had created, the Lord Almighty does not create absolute evil. The Lord Almighty may create evil, but it is not absolute evil, because the Lord Almighty's mercy supersedes the evil that you might actually see. It supersedes, because the Lord Almighty's justice and mercy supersedes the minimal evil that you might actually focus on. So absolute evil is only attributed to man, yet we are permitted to seek cure, help, and change from the evils that may actually prick us as a result of man, or even as a result of natural disasters. So you cannot necessarily say, well, an earthquake happened, therefore, well, it's God's decree. I'll just accept it and that's it. And I'll just live under this rubble. Well, no, don't actually just live under this rubble or whatever it is. You have to seek ways to actually get out of the evil. That's what the Lord Almighty asked you to do, to actually seek ways of finding treatment or whatever it is. And that's why even seeking treatment, even from pain or illnesses or etc., are things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually asked you to do. The Prophet, peace be upon him, actually said, tadawu, seek treatment. So don't just say, well, it's probably Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanting me to live in this pain. I won't have to go see a doctor. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree and that's it. No, the Prophet asked you to go and seek treatment. So what is evil? Well, evil cannot be defined unless you compare it with righteousness and balance. And that's why to redefine evil, you actually have to go back to Quran and Sunnah in speaking about all the different matters in terms of human behavior. Can I call that evil? Do I not call it evil? And so forth. So having that being said, knowledge of our world is actually based on Allah Almighty. So the way that you would identify whether this is ethical or not ethical, this is good or this is evil, is supposed to be by looking through the lens of Quran and Sunnah, because you as a human being, you could easily get manipulated, not only with optical illusions, but you are more susceptible and you are more likely to actually fall in a mental illusion than actually an optical illusion. And that's the same thing. So that's why the Lord Almighty had actually sent us the Quran and Sunnah to help us recognize, in terms of at least what is ethical, what is not ethical, but also let us also be aware that the data that you have to know the world, that your own senses can actually manipulate you, because usually you would actually think that it's all about maximizing the amount of happiness. Is that necessarily what makes something good? Is it maximizing the amount of happiness? Although this is one of those philosophies out there that to call something good, it's all about maximizing the amount of happiness. In fact, the Western trend is all about maximizing the amount of happiness and the amount of acceptance. And we're in the social media, What it has affected is how we perceive something ethical by more of social acceptance. That if there's social acceptance, that proves that something is to be categorized as something that is good. When in reality, we may not recognize that it's not necessarily the people that we would use or as the resource to determine something good or evil. But with social media, it has actually created a new social currency that is affecting even the younger generation, that it's all about acceptance, that it's all about acceptance. And that's what creates the maximizing the amount of happiness. If it maximizes the amount of happiness, then therefore it should be perceived as good, ethical, acceptable, and you cannot judge me otherwise. Because if it gives me the amount of happiness as an individual, then you, as an outside of my body, should not actually judge me this way. This is the Western trend right now. And it's all about, it's called existentialism, in where I decide my purpose. I decide what makes something give me the amount of happiness. I, as an individual, am the source and the resource of defining what makes something ethical, what makes something good, what makes something to be nothing but you embracing it as acceptable and not judging me for it. And this is basically this is just putting the implications of what is called postmodernism in a nutshell, that embodies existentialism, which is the philosophy of you creating the purpose and not the purpose actually making your life. In other words, it's the essence that you create and not the essence preceding your existence. In Islam, it's the essence that precedes existence and not the other way around. As for individualism, it's not the individual or how we maximize the happiness inside the individual, but it's actually the Lord Almighty that determines whether this is good or whether this is bad. Because you lack data as a human being to know whether we're talking about your future or whether we're talking about the essence that you were created for. So the whole thing about living your essence is all supposed to be heading towards the essence that preceded your existence, which is why you were created. You were created to be tested. In where, with that being said, when we look at the definition of evil in Islam, evil is actually within, going into an opposition of the preservation of DNAIM. So what is D? D, this is an acronym. So D, if it's talking about evil, lacking guidance in understanding the purpose of your existence is supposed to be the absolute evil. That's the highest level of evil someone can live in where they're totally living in misguidance in the main thing that is founding and making the establishment of why they're actually living. Number two, failing to attain security and stability in life is the second level of evil, whether you're harming your life or you're harming others' lives. In other words, failing to preserve other people's lives or failing to preserve your life is the second absolute evil that you can commit. Number three, failing to have the most important knowledge that puts in guidance or failing to maintain a healthy mind is the third level of the most absolute evil that you can actually preserve or you can actually commit, And failing to secure your chastity and family is the fourth level of the most evil thing that you could do. Why are we talking about the most evil thing that you could do? Because if you don't recognize what is evil, you don't know what is good. That's the only way to know it. For you to know what is beautiful is actually knowing what is beautiful is by knowing what is ugly. To identify what is white is by knowing what is black. That's the same thing. You have to understand the only reason why I would say this is a frame, this is where it ends, this is where it begins, is because I've got a border for it. There's no way that you can maintain any identity or border if you don't actually preserve those identities and those borders, or else if you're going to be so lucid, if you're going to be so, what is the word, fragile, if you're going to be so uh, elastic, flexible, elastic, in where you're going to expand your area of border and get it smaller, then without you recognizing, you're going to lose your border. The second you lose your border, you actually lose your identity. And this is extremely important, because if we don't recognize where culture, religion, etc., what is my main important border? Your main important border is actually your deen. Number 5 is basically the fifth most evil thing that you could do is actually to fail in having halal rizq, or even spending money halal way. So it's money coming in and it's money going out. How are you actually spending it? Well, that's why when we actually put these together, it's also important. So how do we actually understand trauma? How do we understand all the different things? It's basically by understanding that the Lord Almighty, له مقاليد السماوات والأرض. The Lord Almighty is actually the force behind everything that you see around you. So for example, you might actually put in the effort to study, you got a degree, and you're actually working. You might actually say, well, I got this degree, now I'm working with my degree. It's because I'm so smart. I happen to actually get that. Or I put the effort, etc. Now, here's the thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that no, the actual one to give you rizq is actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The actual one to give you health is actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not necessarily because you maintained a healthy diet. So does that mean we should just throw the effort to put in studying, or the effort to put in maintaining healthy diet, or whatever it is that we should just throw it out of the window because it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told you to put in that effort, but he told you to be careful from thinking that the effort is what actually brought in the product. So what does that mean? You put in the seed inside the soil, but what actually gave that seed the energy, the momentum, the power to grow in a plant is not you. You put in the effort to put that seed in the soil. But the one to actually give it the force, the energy, power to grow in a tree, yes, you had to put in some form of energy to plant it, to put the right amount of soil, the amount of heat that is necessary for that particular plant, whatever it is. You put in that effort, and through studying to figure out what is necessary. But the actual force that made this possible is actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the force that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in this world, even the laws, whether it's the laws in biology or the laws of physics or all these different things that surround it, is actually put by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So don't separate the laws of physics or the laws of biology. Don't separate it as it's basically just there. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put those forces there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put those forces there, and that's the same thing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a raziq. He's the one that gives you rizq. You just have to put in some little force, but that little force is not whatsoever for you to manipulate yourself, that is all what brought in the rizq. Don't confuse yourself. Whether it's the intelligence or whether it's the studying, you put in the effort, and the Lord Almighty will give you the effort, will bring you indeed the product. And certainly how influential, how efficient, how productive your effort is going to be. Definitely, the Lord Almighty told you that there are certain sunan, there are certain laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in nature. You put this much work, decide to put in a greenhouse and you put in the right amount of soil, the right amount of heat and the right place and all of that, the amount of laborers to work and farmers and etc. All of that is definitely part of actually doing the effort. But we cannot narrow down effort to only being physical. Effort can also be mind, mental. How much of thought, how much of studying did you do in order to make a better harvest? All of that is part of the effort, but that is not the only effort, because the real power, the real force to make all of this is actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the most important vision that we take. And that's why in this hadith, Ibn Abbas said, I was behind the Prophet ﷺ one day, and he said, Ya ghulam, inni u'allimuka kalimat. Oh, son or young boy, young man, I'm teaching you a couple of words. Preserve the path of the Lord Almighty, and the Lord Almighty will preserve you. If you seek Allah, if you seek any matter, that is, then ask the Lord Almighty. If you seek refuge in people, or if you seek refuge in something, or you needed support and aid in something, then seek it in the Lord Almighty, and know that all the nations, even if they were to unite, they would not be capable of supporting you unless the Lord Almighty had actually wanted to give it to you. In other words, decreed it for you. And that's the same thing. Even if they were to unite in harming you in any way, they would not be able to do so unless the Lord Almighty wills it. In other words, the real understanding of when we're talking about the different harm that surrounds you, it's not the people. It's actually whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows it or not. It's that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually the one to be the force that controls all the world around you. So don't manipulate yourself, and don't live in fear of people, or in fear of future, or in fear of past. It's putting everything in place, and know that whether it's the past, or whether it's the future, or whether it's people, or whether it's your job, they do not determine your life, your happiness, or even your future. Because that is only in the force of the Lord Almighty. That's in the hands of the Lord Almighty. And even if you may see certain effect of force, etc., that doesn't mean that they have all the power, or it has all the power. So what does that build within you? It builds within you, instead of stressing about past, or stressing even about future, what's going to happen to me, or stressing about your current situation, that you always redirect your vision, that the Lord Almighty's mercy and justice overcomes any pain that might have passed or to come. I would have the hope in the Lord Almighty, and I would recognize that there's no way that pain, the Lord Almighty will let it prevail, and that the Lord Almighty's justice will bring me in the compensation. And that's why the Lord Almighty says in Surah Al-Isra, وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. And whoever was killed in an oppressive manner, then the Lord Almighty will actually make even those that are his guardians actually have some form of authority, some form of power. Why? Because no way that the Lord Almighty will let evil prevail, but there will be compensation. You just have to seek the potential where the Lord Almighty actually put it in. Suffering will always be there, but the way you react to it is what needs to be changed. You see that one, Eminem? Suffering will always be there. It's how you react to it. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. The Lord Almighty will not change the situation that you're in, except or unless you change the way you react to it. And at the end, realizing that is where change actually happens. So pain is not all absolute evil. It may be Allah's way to redirect your direction towards what is best for you in this life or even in the hereafter. So it's all about, don't focus on your weakness and focus on Allah Almighty's power that brings in the hope. It's redirecting your vision. And instead of seeing that, remember, there are several causes that may lead to depression, hormonal, genetics, trauma, etc. But some depression may actually result of losing faith.
Can you go back to the last slide, please, for a minute? For a second.
Oh, sure. You wanted to comment on it?
No, I want to take a photo.
Oh.
Before this one.
This one?
No, go back. Don't focus on your weaknesses. That one, I think, right?
Yeah, don't focus
Okay.
on your
Yeah.
weakness.
So Aysha, is it okay we can
Yeah.
get this like?
I'll give you all the slides. I'll send them. I'll
I'll
send them. I'll send all the slides. That way you can have them. Yep, don't worry. So at the end of the day, is that when we actually look at suffering, depression, yes, we're human beings at the end of the day, but it's all about, well, recognizing that there are different things that may be surrounding you. Yes, it can be, even if you're a believer, can there be some trauma that might actually harm me, even though I related positively with it? Number one. So there are several causes that may lead to depression or even trauma or whatever it is. Is it necessarily a sign of bad faith? So some depression definitely can actually in itself result in having you lose your faith. And that's why the Lord Almighty actually says, وَمَا يَقْنُطْ مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الضَّالُّونَ. The only ones to actually lose their hope in the Lord Almighty are really the ones that are in delusion. Why delusion? Well, they're in delusion because they focused on their weakness. They focused on exaggerating the power that inflicted the pain on them. They exaggerated the force that inflicted the pain on them. And whether it's exaggerating their weakness or exaggerating in the force, that the materialistic force or what is surrounding them, that it has all the power and where they would actually live in that trauma. All of those are actually part of losing faith in the Lord Almighty. Why? Because the true power to actually determine or control the world, the true force, is actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why the Lord Almighty always says in many ayat, لَهُ مَقَالِدُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. He's the one that controls the forces in the heavens and on earth. So it's not that these forces of probably, whether it's the electrical forces or chemical forces, that's not what actually makes things happen. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you it's not necessarily matter in motion. The motion is actually the power of the Lord Almighty. So once you recognize that, don't exaggerate the power of those that inflicted pain on you, and don't exaggerate your weakness. That's what will gain and give you the freedom and give you the power. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was mentioning that the ones to actually have that loss of power, loss in understanding the mercy and the power of the Lord Almighty, are the ones to actually live in delusion. What delusion? They misunderstood, they lost, they manipulated themselves in how they understand the power of force and what force really controls all the matters that surround them. But there are other situations of depression that may be a result of our own human nature. This is extremely important to mention, because when you look at Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, his father, when his son, we know the story, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized that وتولى عنهم وقال يا أسفا على يوسف وابيضت عيناه من الحزن فهو كظيم. What happened? What happened was that Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, he recognized, although the ayah, emphasizes that he was actually saying, قال إنما أشكو بثي وحزني إلى الله. I only complain to the Lord Almighty. But the deep sorrow, the deep sadness that he was in, the ayah said, وَبْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ. His eyes developed, whether it's cataract or developed some sort of illness that affected him and affected his body. And in fact, it made him lose his sight. So the depression went from a stage of affecting the person psychologically to affecting their body physically. And he actually lost his sight. Did he actually not have enough hope in the Lord Almighty? This is a prophet, he's infallible. This is a prophet, he's infallible to actually lose his vision in understanding that their hope is in Allah Almighty. And that's why he was actually saying, وَأَعْلَمُ مِنَ اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And I know from the Lord Almighty what you don't know. But at the end of the day, this is human nature. So not necessarily, if a person is going through depression, not necessarily a sign of bad faith. But certainly when we're looking about speaking to the side of, let's call it pastoral, the pastoral side of working with Muslims and how we would try to assist them. It's like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that controls all the matters. That's to give them the power to gain their momentum and their hope in Allah Almighty, in order to, rather than focus on the trauma itself, to actually focus on the hope that Allah Almighty will never let trauma supersede or be beyond the pain itself. So we would basically learn, how do I actually deal it? What should we do? So how does a Muslim actually deal with trauma? Number one, bring in the clarity in uplifting suffering comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Bring in the clarity that don't lose your hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't focus on the pain, but focus on the Lord Almighty, that he's the one that controls all the matters. That most dangerous evil is the evil of sin and its effect on us. And when the world closes on you, put your trust in the Lord Almighty. He's the one that's capable of redirecting you and redirecting your goal. So instead of putting all the focus on the pain, you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the patterns in the world, and that no harm will overcome the ease is the rule that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually put and laid in this world. You may not recognize how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does his matter. I always say the story, I don't know if I've said it before, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, puts you in these different situations. I one time got a phone call, this young girl, Palestinian. I was able to recognize really from the accent that she was Palestinian, and the girl was just calling me and telling me to help her. And I said, "Where are you?" And she said, "I don't know where I am." I said, "Okay, well, tell me the state that you're in." And she said, "Well, I don't know what state I'm in." I said, "Tell me the city." "I don't know the city." "Do you speak English?" "I don't speak English." "Okay, what can I help you with?" "My husband is asking me to do illicit behavior with his friends. Please, I'm running away with my baby. I need your help." "Okay, whose phone are you calling from?" It was a random person on the street. So I said, "Can you give the phone to them? Maybe they can tell me where they are." So I talked to this person, and he was American. And he just said, "Well, I just saw this woman running away with this baby, carrying a baby with diapers. And here I am." And she asked to use the phone, and I just gave her my phone. I don't know who she is, and I don't know what she wants. So I said, can you give me the address so I can pick her up or anything? And turned out that she was actually in Bloomington. So I drive all the way to where she is. And subhanAllah, I bring her to my house and then she then tells me and asks if she can use the phone to call her parents. SubhanAllah, I said, sure. And do you know their parents' phone number? She was only 22 years old and her husband, I believe, was 65 years old. She called her parents and her parents said, whose family are you with right now? And I told her, Wazwaz family. You can tell them who I am and I'll be happy to talk. They wanted to make sure she was safe. So I talked to them. And subhanAllah, he was like, do you know this person and that person? I said, this is my grandfather that you're talking about, and that's my uncle. SubhanAllah, what a small world. So later I asked my uncle if he knew her father, and he said, yes, I know her father. I happened to be driving in the city far away from Jerusalem, so it's about almost 50 miles from Al-Quds, so 50 miles, and the weather was very cold, very icy, and the car just all of a sudden stops in front of this house. In where it was snowing, the car won't start, it just stopped in front of this house. That's it. He had no choice. Either die of, hypothermia, or you're going to basically knock at this family's house, whoever they are, and ask for help. So he just decided it was too late at night. So just called them, knocked at the door, and he said, well, you see the situation that I'm in, please help me. So the man just said, why don't you just sleep over for the night? He sleeps over that night and basically doesn't recognize that just as he had assisted my uncle 22 years back, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought his own nephew to assist his daughter, who was not even born. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ways. In where whatever good you do, it will come back to you. It will come back to you. It's not just the force of good, but it's also the force of evil. She actually got it from an American woman. She told her, I need help. She didn't know who to call. So she said, maybe you can get me a shaykha. So she just Googled that woman, not the girl, but that neighbor. She Googled shaykha and she just wrote down her number that one day I'll be calling this person. And subhanAllah, it's a small world. But it's important to see, how the good that you do, it will be the force that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring to you. Her father didn't know that this little good that he had done, and he probably doesn't even know the rest of the story, by the way. He didn't recognize that he did this piece of good and he aided someone that was stranded, left in the cold weather, in the snow. But the Lord Almighty was going to bring him someone who was going to be there for his own daughter. You never know how Rabbil Alameen connects these dots together. And that's why when we're not just saying this story, but we're just seeing the inspiration from these little stories of how you may not recognize, but the Lord Almighty has his ways. So that's why put in the sadaqah. When the Prophet ﷺ actually said, Dawu mardakum bis sadaqat. You want your ill loved ones to actually find cure, put in sadaqah. You might think, well, how's that even related to that? No, it's actually going to the doctor. Yes, go to the doctor. But you also don't recognize that there is a force. There is a force. Yes, go to the doctor, seek treatment, but that's not the only force that controls your matters. That's the point. That's not the only force that controls your matters. To think of it as, yes, it's just to seek medication is not understanding that this world is far more complex in its forces than A and B is to equal C. It's a lot more complex because the Lord Almighty actually tells you that the forces that he actually puts in this world are his forces, not the forces that you might actually think as the only effort, chemical or physical effort that you put in. So the first start is to actually redirect your vision and how you view trauma and stress. It's basically putting in that spiritual therapy in where you guide yourself, that you put in the effort, but the rest is on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So turn to your Lord Almighty and seek his help in his path. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, Alam nashrah laka sadrak, wa wada'na anka wizrak, alladhi anqadha dhahrak. Were we not the ones to actually bring ease to your heart? How? وَضَعْنَا عَنْكَ وِزْرَكَ. You would assume that the ease actually comes from materialistic things, more money, better life, more quality of life. That's ease. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, no, وَضَعْنَا عَنْكَ وِزْرَكَ. What actually brought in the ease on the inside is when you had actually abstained from sin. When we had forgiven you your sins, then the implication of sin actually was removed. And that's why you were feeling the ease on the inside. We usually think of ease coming from the outside, whether it's a nice car, it's gaining more publicity, it's a bigger house, it's name branded clothes, it's all of these different things. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, no, those things don't actually make up as the formula to what brings in happiness. Bigger beds don't bring in sleep. They can make a better quality of sleep, but they don't make sleep. And that's the same thing. When we're talking about houses, that's not necessarily what makes a home. You can have a hut a person living in, but the people in there are actually happier than a person that's living in a mansion. So what makes a home, what makes tranquility is not the materialistic side of it. That's only one factor of it, not all the factor. Not all the factors, and not certainly the main factor. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَوَضَعْنَا عَنْكَ وِزْرَكَ. What actually brings in the ease, what brings in the happiness, what brings in the tranquility on the inside is really when you had lived away from sin, when you had redirected your spirituality and not only focused on your physical side. It's not mortifying your body by all means, but it's actually redirecting your vision to understanding where the real trauma and the real anxiety comes from. The real anxiety actually comes from when we're empty on the inside. When we're empty on the inside, when we're empty from the meaning of value, when we're empty from the meaning of giving, when we're empty from the meaning of embracing, when we're empty from the meaning of sharing, when we're empty from the meanings of values and akhlaq and mannerisms. Why is anxiety right now rampant? Why are the numbers actually going stronger and higher and bigger? And even in the younger generation, like never before in Gen Z, when all the different means of life are actually given to them, it's actually going farther because life right now that we're living in, it's all about focusing on giving the body. It's all focusing on trying to bring in entertainment, trying to bring in maximizing the happiness by maximizing the body entertainment, by maximizing the amount of pleasure. But we could see that maximizing the pleasure is not what actually brings in happiness. We know it. Yep.
So I was at a conference and they were talking about how in Muslim communities, they're seeing an increase in mental health issues.
Mhm.
Why is that? And they said specifically Muslim communities are experiencing.
So there, the Rania Awad, I am aware of the study that Rania Awad had done in terms of the mental illness actually growing in the Muslim community.
And the reason is, again, the contradiction or faith with the world we're living in.
Right.
Why is that?
So there are actually a number of different reasons to, of course, I know Rania Awad was speaking about that the Muslim community is not aware of the situation. At many times, the Muslims would assume that things like postpartum depression or depression is a sign of bad faith. So they would have the stigma from actually working on, one, recognizing it, two, in treating it and dealing with it. So if they don't want to recognize it, they don't want to face it, then they would be the most ones to be prone to it. And at the same time, when you look at the society itself, I don't want to say that depression is all necessarily not related to faith. I would say that some of it is actually related to faith. Some of it is related to faith in a stance in where when we actually see if faith can actually bring in a treatment to some types of depression, not all types, some types of depression or mental disorders definitely may require medications. That's a different thing. There's no doubt about that. And it's really sad that at many times the Muslim community is still, I would say, very primitive in understanding mental health. So things like bipolar, schizophrenia, OCD, they would just shun it as, oh, shut up, you're just being spoiled. You're just complaining too much. When in reality, this person, or schizophrenia, that this person is dealing with shaitan or dealing with a jinn. And they would go through ruqya after ruqya, not recognizing that, no, they actually need to see a psychiatrist. Meds do really help. But within the community, mental health is perceived that no, only atheists who are dealing with people as if they were matter in motion are the ones that are actually promoting that. And that's a very common misconception. So I would say, yes, definitely, I agree that mental health is definitely misunderstood within the Muslim community, big time, because of a number of different reasons, like I mentioned, which is their misunderstanding of the religion. Having a mental health issue that needs to be treated is not always related to faith, not always related to faith. Being schizophrenic is exactly like a person with cancer. This is an illness, and that's an illness. To actually think that cancer is because they deserve to have cancer is a wrong and a totally wrong understanding of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pricks pain and why he puts us in these situations. Same thing. If we're talking about schizophrenia, it's not necessarily because they deserved it. It's not a shaitan somehow in control of them. In fact, it was actually, there is a Pakistani, I forgot what his name is, but he's actually a Pakistani psychiatrist. He did an outstanding research in regards to psychiatry, mental illness, and Islam. Forgot something, Amber something. I forgot I forgot the last name, but I can get you his study. Who?
I don't remember. He was at the conference, but he's based in Chicago.
This one is actually based in UAE.
Oh, right.
He's based in UAE. He had actually written a number of different articles in a number of different journals in regards to mental illness and Islam, and how the Muslims were actually the first to speak about mental illness and have even special hospitals for mental illness. So I would say it's not necessarily Islam. When the Muslims in the Muslim medical specialists at the time understood where Islam is, they were able to identify where medical treatment is necessary. But when the Muslims didn't understand and they lost their understanding of deen, that's when they went into superstition. That's when they went into superstition. So I would say when we lost our ilm in deen, that's why it was going to be, that's why, the natural outcome is that we right now would associate mental illness either to the fragility of that person, or we would attribute it that it's shaitan or jinn related. Therefore, what we need to do is just find this magic wand that's going to do this ruqya, which might actually cost $6,000 per hour. This is real. Check this out. I had a family one time. This is real. So you might want to change your practice one day. This is real. This is real, you guys. I had a family one time contact me. They're like, we want you to do ruqya. I said, why me do ruqya? It's not like I'm some type of a holy guru, sheikha. It's like, I'm a normal human being like you. I've got my sins. I just don't tell you about it. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I said, here's what you could do. Here's the ruqya that you could do. And they said, no, you have to do it. I said, my dear, I don't have to do it. It's going to be the same Quran. I'll tell you the ayat. I'll tell you what you need to read, and you do the part. You don't need me. And they said, no, please, we want you to do it. So I said, you know what? You've got some different raqis probably in Dallas. I'm sure you'll find somebody there. And they said, well, we contacted them. They actually said they take $6,000 per hour, mind you. And his appointments are far out till 4 months. So I don't know, Dr. Simon, what you're doing. You're definitely in the wrong practice. I know that. You're definitely in the wrong practice. I'll give you some training in ruqya. You'll probably make a better clinic. This is real. I mean, can you imagine? You know what? Even if I were to book with a neurologist or dermatologist who are usually hard to find an appointment with, you wouldn't actually have the appointments 4 months out. You wouldn't have 4 months, 4 months to, neurologists are hard to book with, but you can go to your own clinic and figure out, you'll get somewhere in there. But if you're actually talking about 4 months and $6,000 per hour, how much money are these people making? Now, I'm sorry, but this is not acceptable. I don't know how these people are accepting this. This is by far selling the deen of Allah. I cannot but say that. What was that? What was that?
The patients don't know how to read Arabic probably.
No, but but still, it just tells you, this is real. If you're not.
People are hiring others to do istikharas too for that.
Well, no. It's a serious matter. It's a serious matter. It's a serious matter that I think we really have to look into.
The job openings are open. So, right, you know how much you can make.
You know how much you can make, exactly. It's not hard. Couple ayat, you don't have to practice all the Quran by all means. Just a couple ayat, you're not going to be practicing much. And you got some water, just read on that water and start swimming.
Mashallah, Aysha is just giving all the free advice.
And free advice, and you guys can go and start opening your clinics. You don't need a license, by the way.
Exactly.
And no studying too, just a couple.
Just
This is-
This is still stuff, so does that help people?
So it does, I'll tell you, it does, but it depends on what case you're talking about. That's why I'm saying it can be a manipulation.
Yeah.
It can be a manipulation because if somebody is schizophrenic, right, and you're doing ruqya, yes, it does make the person feel better. Just like if I were to read the right now, I hope you're feeling better, listening to this lecture, but that was more of a spiritual healing, but it doesn't necessarily change everything in you. Now, when we're speaking about schizophrenia, for example, we know that this is kind of like giving you like a morphine, and where it's calming you now, but it doesn't actually heal the problem. It's like putting a Band-Aid. Just like when you get a child, he's complaining, this is actually hurting me, and you're just putting a Band-Aid, and you know that Vaseline or a Band-Aid doesn't actually take away the pain. but it just makes him feel better that something was done about it.
So just recently, I think a lot of us have heard that lecture, Yasir Qadi talked about this. And very briefly, one of the examples I'm going to share is he said, him initially was very against, like, and he would just say this is nothing because the way he was brought up. And then he said, I'm asking forgiveness because my thought process changed. It's both things, like Quran
Oh,
and then this.
absolutely.
But the example he gave was of this guy who would keep coming to him. And he was like, I read Quran, I do tahajjud, and he was still crying, what do I do? And then Yasir Qadi sent him to, yeah, and just one, I think, pill, he was not suicidal anymore.
So no, I agree with you. I mean, there are many situations where I would actually send the people and actually say, listen, I'll do the ruqya for you as a spiritual healing, but the real treatment is supposed to be probably through psychiatry or whatever, it's a rheumatologist,
yeah.
whatever the reason or whatever is causing the intellect, the illness, all right? But to actually just focus on the ruqya itself. There are cases where only ruqya is necessary. Only ruqya. To actually say, yeah, go to GI, etc., you're just wasting your time.
Yeah.
Because the test, they'll run all the tests. They'll tell you there's nothing wrong with you.
Exactly, and you're still.
They will run all the tests. And I've had cases where literally they've run all the tests and they said there's nothing wrong with them. I was in denial that there was anything, but then when I did the ruqya to them to discover that they were suffering from sihr for a very long time and I didn't know about it. You cannot necessarily look at the person and say, yeah, this is this and this is that. But at the end of the day, to actually do the ruqya and also do, the necessary, let's say, treatment is also important.
So I just want to
Just
add
a-
something.
just a
You know how you have this slide, how to deal with trauma. So now, at that point, but what they were trying to educate the Muslim community was that the response should be talking to someone, either not a psychologist, they did not encourage talking to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, rather a Muslim counselor. If you have any stress, any anxiety, and why I'm asking is that we have been brought up to refer to Quran or to what, which still is true, but they said it is mandatory to be talking to a therapist or a counselor or even a mentor or.
So I agree seeing a Muslim mentor or a Muslim counselor is definitely necessary, and even a Muslim specialist. There's no doubt about that. No doubt about that. But I think, going back to what you were talking about in terms of why is mental illness right now growing within the Muslim community, I think at many times we're just narrowing the reasons that are causing mental illness to either jinn or the fragility of the person. And at the same time, even say that by fixing these points is also wrong. Because to say that religion itself is not a factor is also wrong. That doesn't mean that, let's not practice dichotomy here and say, well, if religion is a factor, therefore anybody that has depression or anxiety is basically because lacking deen. No, that's not to go into that dichotomy. Mental illnesses actually have many factors. But the side of deen that I want to emphasize on, one of the main factors that's also making the numbers of mental illnesses increase within our community is, one, the misinformation in regards to deen, letting them associate mental illness to superstition. Two, not only the misunderstanding, but also the misunderstanding in spirituality, in where we have to redirect the aqidah and even the Muslims, in where it's not block of information of aqidah, but it's actually living the inspiration of aqidah itself, in where you're making that, just like in this ayah, in where وَرَفَعْنَا لَكَ ذِكْرَكَ, just as seeing the inspiration of how, when we're relating to Islam, that you're actually connecting with the power of the Lord Almighty. Unfortunately, even when Aqidah is taught, it's taught in a very rigid manner. The names and attributes of the Lord Almighty are supposed to be the main crux of all teaching Aqidah. And where, how do I relate with the names and attributes? How do I relate with the power of the Lord Almighty? How do I relate to the authority of the Lord Almighty? How do I relate that the Lord Almighty is the one that determines mercy and justice, and that I'm not doomed in the situation that I'm in? That part of the faith, a main point and a place of point in faith is where I recognize that the Lord Almighty is the one that's going to help me deal with the trauma, is the one that's helping me face the future. Just like in the hadith that we mentioned earlier, where the Prophet ﷺ was actually teaching Abdullah ibn Abbas, and mind you, Abdullah ibn Abbas at the time was only almost 10 years old. And that's why he said, Ya ghulam. He was redirecting him to seeing that, listen, whatever happened to you in the past, don't let yourself get fixated on that point. And I want you to look ahead. Whatever happens in the future, I don't want you to think that whatever happens in the future, that it's just doomed and decreed and everything. That's it. I'm just never going to change anything. No, you put in the effort to make the change. So what we really need to see is, why is the Muslim community really facing the mental illness and the numbers are being rampant? It's really, one, the ignorance, two, in how we relate to our faith itself, how we have to redirect our vision, how we need to make our masajid be a place of spiritual healing. Because the other side, so why don't Jews or Christians actually face all of that? Because they at least get redirected to another type of motivation speaking, motivational type of counseling. The motivational type of counseling where it's helping them redirect their perspective. It's getting them redirected. So that's the same thing, in where once our masajid actually understand the important role of Muslim counselors, but on a condition that we understand. Pause right there. It is extremely sad to admit that, yes, I do encourage the Muslims to go to Muslim counselors, but it's really sad to admit that a lot of the Muslim counselors have actually embraced the Western ideology without them recognizing where, epistemologically speaking, where is that fine line. So a lot of the Muslim counselors, they basically graduated high school from an American high school and only got some Sunday programs and probably occasionally went to the masjid, but in reality, all of their minds have actually been indoctrinated with the Western philosophy, with the Western individualism, with the Western narrative, and etc. And that's how they actually got their license. It was through the Western ideology, through the Western understanding of theodicy, evil, trauma, a life, purpose of life, and the list goes on and on. So it's really sad to admit that, yes, although I do encourage to see Muslim counselors, but it's also very sad to also recognize I've seen many Muslim counselors that just literally put a coating, a wrapper on Western ideology and just give me just some words here and there that they actually had heard the masjid or the imam or whatever it is. And then they thought that, okay, now I can infuse both together. And this is extremely sad. The other day, I was actually listening at a lecture in where it was supposed to be, a counselor that was supposed to be directing and what makes a happy marriage for the Muslim girls, etc. And she was actually saying that, and part of what she was saying is that that the relationship is a struggling for survival. Even an atheist doesn't embrace social Darwinism to actually think that the relationship between my husband and I is a struggling for survival. Seriously. So I'm going to be taking away his food, going to be taking away his things, and just giving him the amount that just keeps him alive that is necessary for me, because it's a struggling for survival. Is this really Islam at all? This is kufr on the spot. The struggle for survival is not even embraced by the atheists themselves, at least the social Darwinism. They actually regarded that is within nature, but they didn't embrace it on the social level. Just imagine that. If it's going to be this idea, and this is a counselor that was teaching all the girls and all these, it was all of it, just Western philosophy, Western definition of feminism, Western definition of individualism, all of that. And then it was basically a hijabi girl who's right now speaking, I would say, really, all of the Western thought, but just giving some, I would say, taken out of context quotes from Islam and Sunnah. This is problematic. So what we really need to revive is really how we even teach the Muslim counselors. We still have a lot of work to do, but I'm optimistic. But inshallah, we'll get there. Now, it's redirecting the perspective in where, remember, if Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam was not thrown in the well, he would never have reached the king's fortress. And if he was not imprisoned, he would not have learned what he had learned and reached the king and recognized for the injustice done to him. If you were not squeezed out of your mother's womb, you would not have been in the vast world. And in the story of Ali Tantawi, where he said one time, he mentions the story where he was, of course, Ali Tantawi, just a note, is actually a judge in Syria. He was a judge in Damascus, Syria. He said, I was with his other friends with in a home in Damascus, Syria, hang out during the night, of course, halal hangout. This is a judge here. He said, all of a sudden felt that I couldn't breathe. I was suffocating. So he gets out and says he just decides to go out and just get some fresh air. So he goes out, and while he was walking in the streets of Damascus, he said that I then hear a woman crying in one of the corners. So he says, I come and approach her and I see, why is she crying? So she says, well, who are you to ask me? You're not going to do anything about it. He said, well, just tell me, maybe I can help. And she said, well, my husband divorced me and he took my children away from me and threw me out of the house, and now I'm here. He said, why didn't you go to the court? She said, well, the court was not going to listen to me. No court was going to accept me. No judge is going to listen to me. So he said, she didn't know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought the judge to her right at her feet. Right at her feet. And that's the thing, it's that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not only brought him, but he brought him from his throat. Now you're gonna go and see this woman that is oppressed, who the Lord Almighty is the one that redirects all your matters. So don't feel that that's it, this is the end of it. The Lord Almighty will be the one to bring you safety and savior, and bring you all the different things, and your rizq will actually be coming to your door and will be at your service. So what should you do? فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ. Once you finish all your matter, فَانْصَبْ. Stand and just reach out to the Lord Almighty. Once you see all the doors are closed on you from the people, don't forget to reach out to the Lord Almighty, for his door would never close. Reach out to the Lord Almighty. Even when all the matters have gone evil, know that the Lord Almighty is not the one to actually whatsoever decree all evil. The Lord Almighty controls all the different forces that surround you. So trust in Allah Almighty, in his powers, and don't let your focus be on the harm and suffering, and be your focal point, be on the Lord Almighty. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ajaban li amri al-mu'min." A believer is a strange one. Why? إِنَّ أَمْرَهُ كُلَّهُ لَهُ خَيْرٌ. All the believer, all the matters for a believer, to them, it's always in good. Even when it's an evil thing, yes. Why? Because they know that the Lord Almighty would never prick them with evil just for the sake of evil. That they would recognize, they would redirect the image, their perception that, alhamdulillah, you're going through pain, alhamdulillah. Are you seeking treatment? Alhamdulillah. But I know that my faith is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I know that the Lord Almighty would not whatsoever put me in any harm, but He's wanting me to actually seek the right path towards what is even more important than this in this dunya, which is to actually gain. That's why in Allah, إِذَا أَحَبَّ الْمُؤْمِنِ ابْتَلَاهُ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves a believer, He might actually put them in hard situations. The hard situations are supposed to be the cleansing areas. So you will not be facing the hardship in this life alone. The Lord Almighty, because of your sins, He might put you in hard situations in this life. So in the akhirah, you would not be suffering from the bigger retaliation from the Lord Almighty. So He will want you to get some cleansing in this life because He wants to keep you from the punishment in the hereafter. Because He doesn't want you to punish you then. So in asabathu sarra'a shakar, a believer, they look at all their matters differently. Whenever good happens to them, they'll be thankful. Whenever bad things happen to them, they're just patient. But in order to be patient, basically take a moment to actually embrace the power of the Lord Almighty. So should we embrace Western therapy and Eastern mindfulness in treating trauma and pain? Is there such a thing as Islamic mindfulness and all of that? Should we stop here?
Yeah, we can, it's 136.
136, okay. So what we'll do, this is actually then a whole separate thing, but inshallah, it's a whole.
Yeah, to finish it.
So good.
She did.
Yes. Amna, oh my God, I
And
love this
We should
topic.
continue with this.
So on March,
We should.
Yeah.
on March
Inshallah.
20th, we have another halika at Alfat's house, so we can continue from there.
Inshallah, we'll continue from there.
March
It's within the
20th.
same
Whenever the
thing.
next
Is it
turn,
before
I want
Ramadan
to-
or after Ramadan?
Huh?
Whenever the next turn is, I would like to do it.
So it's in April, we have to discuss because it's Ramadan, so maybe, I don't know if she's okay with that. Or
Maybe
we can
after
skip
Ramadan?
April and come back in May.
So March 20th,
March
which is
20th.
Monday.
Monday and what day?
So inshallah, I guess next time we'll continue with part 2. Should we seek the Eastern mindfulness and Western therapy? How should we deal with that? Is there such a thing as Islamic mindfulness? Just an idea about mindfulness. Okay, so mindfulness, there's this, there's the Western side that embraced a lot of the Eastern mindfulness, and it's all about redirecting your vision, but redirecting your vision, whether it's on your body or breathing, yoga, all of these different methods, or probably martial arts, just like in Confucianism, it's all about martial arts, trying to redirect your vision from focusing on the pain to probably learning how to focus on probably hitting a certain point, or probably engaging in karate or whatever it is, or probably going up in the mountains, or probably, breathing and all of that. How do we can we embrace that? Can we do yoga as a form of mindfulness? Can we do that? And what about the Western type of mindfulness? And can we go to a Muslim psychologist? Or a non-Muslim psychologist, sorry. Can we go to a non-Muslim psychologist? What are the things that we need to know in terms of that? How do we actually work on that? And as a Muslim, is there such a thing as Islamic mindfulness? And how does it work? What are the different things that that Islam has as an alternative to what people are going through. What is the alternative? So that's the Islamic mindfulness. Is there such a thing? Or we here embracing a thought, in other words, a core and a behavior, and where it's kind of like, saying, secular Muslims, there's no such thing. Are we here practicing some form of oxymoron, where it's contradictory, and where no, mindfulness is one particular thing and that you cannot actually have it? Or can we actually say Islamic mindfulness? Is there such a thing? What and how do we actually practice, if there is such a thing as Islamic mindfulness? How do we actually practice it? What do we do? What are the different things that we have to do?
What about how Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to go on Ghar Hira?
We'll talk about that.
Is
We'll
that
talk
what-
about that. So for Ghar Hira,
I know it's maybe more on a very.
well, I can continue. Trust me, I've got all.
I think some people might have.
It's
Yeah.
where this is slide
This is
21.
very interesting, so inshallah.
This is
we'll-
slide 21.
I didn't know.
So 63 minus 21. You do your math.
Oh,
Yes.
so it is enough. So
What is
we-
it?
This is slide 21. So
Oh,
we
okay, no,
actually
inshallah, we'll
have,
do
let's see,
that.
we have 42 slides left.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a totally different topic.
Mm.
There's so much to, there's so much to say.
Yeah, that's
It's
what I
always-
was
it's
saying,
always
part one, so
recorded.
we can continue
Okay.
with it.
Yes,
So I will.
inshallah.
Did you send the
Inshallah.
link then?
Yeah, I will be sending the link.
Inshallah.
Inshallah, I will be sending.
So now you made me think, recently I made a list of therapists and things.
What's
Okay.
But you're right, it could confuse even more
Mhm.
with that.
So we do
uh,
actually have,
understanding.
I don't know,
Going
I'll
to
ask
Muslim
her.
therapists versus, like, depend what they
right.
intention and
Um,
what their understanding.
I
is
did
too.
actually hear of a new place in Roseville, Illuminous Minds or something like that. We've got a number of different therapists there.
So,
Someone's asked me about it and I actually sent it.
so,
Forgot who
And
it was.
Sukoon is
yeah, I
probably
was
they're
at
starting
Sukoon,
that
they
too.
just launched their Sukoon healing.
The
And
Khalil Center as well.
that's in Chicago.
That's in Chicago,
Yeah.
yep.
But that
I think so,
luminous,
Layla Amani or
Layla,
something,
she's from
Layla
there.
Ali is there.
And she is amazing.
Yep, we actually have a couple,
Yeah.
I know Luminous Minds, they've got a number of different psychologists there. I'm not familiar who's actually, the head of the program, but I
So
just
I
know Khalil
feel like
Center.
something like even like before like individual therapy, sometimes we just need the education. Like so, for instance, how we went to that Sukoon healing, it was a launch and a fundraiser, and the way how that sister Layla, she was talking and so many people said like we can just listen to her all day.
Mhm.
Very educational, very connecting.
Mhm. I think that's one thing that our masajid are really missing.
Mhm.
It's, I would say, reviving, just like Al-Ghazali, reviving how we understand faith, how we understand Aqidah. I think, it's really missing within our
I
masajid.
think this is something we
It's
really
really
need.
missing. We really lack it in our masajid. How do we actually connect ourselves with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And that's why I personally like tafsir, because tafsir really helps you connect through the words of the Lord Almighty and puts those connectors, whether we're talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the practice, the aqidah, whether we're talking about the fiqh piece of it, and connecting all these and the stories, etc. So you start living with the flow of the ayat. There's no better place. There's no better place to grow in your faith more than the Quran. There's no better place. But in order for the Quran to be a place of effectiveness, you really have to understand what is being said. You really have to understand how to let these words and these inspirations actually connect with you. And never will the Quran be done and given you from all the gems that it carries. It's always giving you more. There's always more to see. And I would actually prepare tafsir, and I have tafsir that I do in Masjid al-Rahim every single Friday. And in tafsir, like I would prepare and I would say, okay, today we're going to cover these 2 pages. And I find myself, just getting getting so deep in those ayat. I'm trying as much as I can to hurry, but there's so much. And by the way, what the thought that had occurred to me from this tafsir, next week something else comes in. The inspirations, it's not me that I'm just some holy being, but subhanAllah, the words, they contain so many secrets. They contain so many inspirations. They contain so many secrets. It's for you to unearth and dig deep down every single time you read those ayat. Once we let our children, ourselves, connect with the Quran to a higher level than just reading it or just feeling it and just touching it, in where, no, we embrace it to the point that it's actually in our hearts and not flowing on our tongues. That's when you'll see that the true aqidah is coming in. So when we speak about, okay, how do I understand trauma? You recognize, how Prophet Musa alayhi salam was going through different episodes of fear in his life, different episodes of trauma. Prophet Musa was not the only one, but you go through Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, you go through different prophets. You might say, well, that's a story. Yeah, we heard that story so many times, but it's actually living on how they lived the trauma, how it affected them. When you look at Prophet alayhi salam, fear was mentioned frequently, in where his mother was living in fear. Later, who knows if a mother's feelings then transcend into the child's DNA, or who knows what it does. But clearly, he was also living the fear that the mother was actually feeling. It's like, what happened? How does it actually go through the pregnancy? I don't know. But at the end of the day, is that clearly Prophet Musa alayhi salam was always khaif yataraqab. He's always afraid. Fear was always there. But that same fear, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, وَاصْطَنَعْتُكَ لِنَفْسِي. No, I have disciplined you for me. Who's that? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That same person that was always living in stages of fear, when he was the leader then, and the people that were Bani Israel that were with him, they just said, Inna lamulkun. Said, that's it. We're caught. They're going to catch us. That's it. We're doomed. He actually yelled out and he said, Kalla inna ma'iya rabbi sayatin. Absolutely not. Verily not. The Lord Almighty is the one that is with me. He will be the one to guide me. That was the guy that was living in different stages of fear before he was even born. Fear was part of their life, from his mother to the father to the early childhood to every single stage. But the Lord Almighty was telling him, you didn't even recognize that fear was surrounding you from every corner, that man that you are living with is going to be your worst enemy.
Aysha, let's continue this discussion with lunch.
Inshallah.
Can we do dua, please?
Yes. We can make, speaking of fear, Ya Allah, Ya Hayyu, Ya Qayyum, bring us the feeling of yaqeen, bring us the feeling of iman, and bring in the feeling of the yaqeen in our iman and the yaqeen in our children, and bring us the light on our tongue and the light and the steadfastness in our iman and the power of good health in our bodies. And Ya Allah, Ya Hayyu, Ya Qayyum, let us enjoy good health as long as we live in our sight and in our hearing and in our body, أبدا ما أبقيتنا واجعله الوارث منا. And let this always be, as long as we live, be a good health in our body, as long as we live, and let that always, أبدا ما أبقيتنا, as long as you keep us alive, let that always be remain with us. And let there be, Allahumma ja'al fi qulubina nura. Ya Allah, let in our hearts be light, in our eyes be light, in our hearing be light, and let us speak of light, and let our hearts be full of light, and our minds full of light, and our right have light, and our left have light, and up above us, and make us be from those that will spread light. Ya Allah, keep fitna away from us, and fitna away from our children, and keep us always be amongst those that will be leaders to spread the light, live the light, and embrace the light, and make us from those that will always follow the path of the Lord Almighty, your path, O Lord Almighty, and the path of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and make us from those that will always be amongst the Salihin. And when you let us pass, let the last word we would utter is La ilaha illallah. Make us from those that will always live on La ilaha illallah, and make us from those that will rise from the dead on La ilaha illallah. Ya Allah, make us from those that will drink from the water of Al-Kawthar, and make us from those that, just as you had gathered us in this dunya, make us from those that will gather in Jannah together على سرر متقابلين. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. جزاكم الله خيرا, everyone. MashaAllah, we have 14 people even online, and they were coming in and going out. And I don't know, on Facebook we have how many people, so subhanAllah, we've got, alhamdulillah.
This lecture was on YouTube, sister?
It will be on YouTube. Right now it's on Facebook, but I will be happy to answer any questions while you guys are getting food. That's okay.
So how are you gonna share those slides with us?
On this
The
lecture?
same way
WhatsApp?
Yeah.
WhatsApp?
sister,
Then you have to
recorded
individually
lecture.
send it.
This
And
recorded
Yeah, I'll send you the YouTube link.
Okay.
Which WhatsApp is
inshallah.
it?
Yeah, I'll
Just
send you.
regular WhatsApp,
No,
right?
which group is it?
I'm a
Like,
Jam
actually
group, and
you-
I will send it also
Right.
on
Yeah,
you guys.
yeah, and
deal
then,
with it.
yeah, we can forward to each other too, that's fine.
That's okay.
Yeah. No, no.
Okay.
So I shared with
Yep.
the lecture.
What?
It's a beautiful lecture.
Allah yahfadhik ya Rabbi. Allah yahfadhik.
Continue.
Talking back to the same therapist, do you have any, in your experience, who can be the good?
Yeah, that was my question.
I made a list, and I'm
Uh-huh.
sorry, I'm for my patients and all those things, and it will be really informative, who can be the balance between both.
So, like I said, well, I've actually sent to a number of different people, but the thing is that sometimes it's an issue of the person themselves comfortable with the person. So they would have all the same training, but sometimes, especially when we're talking about mental health, sometimes you're more comfortable with that person,
Right.
and you're not comfortable with that person. So sometimes it's really strange. For example, you might have somebody that you just don't like them because they're always smiling.
Right.
You would assume that that's a
Yeah,
good thing.
and that's
But
what happens. Right.
somebody else was like, no, she smiles too much. I've had people that just hated my guts because they thought I was just being too.
Right.
And I've had people that loved me because I was.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but if you have any
Maybe
names,
that's the quality of a good leader.
Yeah.
Either they like you or they hate you.
Yeah, there it is. You know, you can't always assume to
you can please
necessarily inspire everyone or that everyone likes you. It's just what keeps you humble. And that's the same thing with therapists, you know.
But if you have any names, send it to me.
I can think
Because
of
I totally
one.
understand, because sometimes what happens, and I will tell my patients to go to therapy, and that happened very frequently.
Right.
I didn't like the therapist, and it's not just the
Right.
Muslim or anything,
Oh, yeah.
it can happen. And I normally tell them, you go, you try,
Yeah.
and we see whether they connect.
And so
same thing
I
happens
don't
with
know, I
physicians,
mean,
right?
Feminist Minds had actually a couple
Right, I
different
saw that,
people.
yeah.
See them, and if you don't like somebody, they would usually refer you to someone else. So you might want to go to, let's say, that particular person, and you
Right.
say, I don't really, for example, I don't really feel comfortable with continuing with you. Can you recommend someone else? Because they recognize that other people will recommend, them. Once they're transparent in dealing with their patients, they know that other people will be also referring to them. And that it's not necessarily a sign of being a bad therapist. It's just, hey, people have their own preferences that sometimes we don't understand. So little by little, inshallah, you'll find a person that suits you best. You will. I mean, inshallah.
Yes, ma'am.
And
Because
you'll
it is just like getting second, right? Some patients come for any doctors and think, hey, I didn't like that person. So I said,
Yeah.
okay, it's nothing personal. Let's go another opinion,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just a few people, if they're saying
Yeah.
the same thing, fine.
Yeah.
And sometimes as a doctor, we make a mistake too.
Right, right.
You stigmatize, maybe that's the only
Yeah.
thing, you are narrow-minded or narrow kind of vision.
Absolutely.
Style.
It is a style.
Style.
So something one works than the other.
It's a style at many times. It's a style.
Just like you said, yeah, one person is smiling more and
Yeah.
more relaxed. Maybe some person likes it, some people, oh, they're not serious.
I've had people that hated my guts. And I've had people
Right.
that love
love
me
that.
so much, and I'm like, stop.
Right,
This
right.
is putting me at a pedestal. You've got,
Right,
this
right.
is doing me too much. And that's the same thing. It's not just me,
Right,
it's every single one. They'll come to you, it's like, oh my God, I just absolutely love her.
Right.
And you'll have somebody else that will like, I absolutely
Right,
hate her.
right, right.
She's just so proud,
Right.
arrogant, not even listening. Like, okay,
I know. But no, mashallah.
Allah barik fik.
Yeah, kind of crying well.
Sorry about that. Sometimes I go into crying mode myself. I don't know if people actually have, oh, how long is the break? Well, actually, that's the end. The break, inshallah, we will be continuing this March 20th, inshallah. Yeah, I will be telling you part 2 if you're on Gems of Lake group, so I will be sending it March 20th. You are? Listen. No? Okay. So inshallah, we will continue. If there are any questions online, I'd be happy to answer them. Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. All right, I guess this is it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone.